Hi, folks. This is Cinepunked, and I'm your host, Robert J. E. Simpson. I'm delighted that we've been asked to contribute this panel discussion for the Dark Hedges Film Festival. And tonight we are going to be talking all about the horror of isolation, which sounds like a lot of fun. I'm very, very pleased to be joined by a couple of dear friends and former colleagues of mine. That's David L. Rattigan and Keri O'Shea. And we're going to be sort of steering this conversation as things go. But I think the first thing for me to do is to let you see my colleagues. So here's David and Keri. Say hello.
Hi. Nice to
Oh,
be here.
So horrors of isolation. I mean, the reality is that we've just spent the last, I don't know how many months now. This is 2020 after all, for anyone who's watching us in the far distant future where these things are just a distant memory. Oh, please let that be the case. Lockdown and the pandemic that we've been living through has obviously tested many of us in many, many ways. And things like isolation has become a reality for the first time. So whenever I think about sort of horror and isolation, I think one of the first things I tend to think about is probably Stanley Kubrick's film The Shining, in which we've got these small family unit trapped in the middle of a huge hotel in the middle of nowhere, cut off from civilization. Am I alone in pinpointing that one as my kind of my starting off point, Keri?
no, not at all. I think it's one of the first films I rewatched actually after lockdown was announced. So there's obviously something there that chimes with this isolation, this kind of tendency, this feeling of being on your own. I think it does it particularly well. There's just something quite cold and quite remote, obviously not just in terms of the landscape and the time of year, but the way that it's shot, that the coloration of it and the ways that characters interact with one another. It's got that slightly fever dream kind of a feel to it, which I just think captures something of the strangeness of being away from society and being completely on your own in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, it's an incredibly unsettling film. I've seen it, I think, probably about 3 times because despite being quite the film buff, I'm not the sort of Kubrick fanboy that seems to be obligatory if you're sort of film buff my age. And I found it quite scary the first time I watched it, which was about 20 years ago now. And then when I revisited it again, it hit me quite cold, really, in the wrong way, in that I just didn't, it didn't really gel with me. And then I have rewatched it this week because, of course, it's been mentioned in our conversations because it's an obvious candidate for one of those isolation horror films. And it was rather too near the knuckle because I've really felt the effects of this isolation and the lockdown, being away from friends, being on my own a lot. Obviously, we've been through various vicissitudes of how isolated we are and such. But I guess depending on what your career is and what sort of lifestyle you have, I have one where I'm involved in lots of things. I do a lot of sort of arts related things, church related things, a lot of social things, and I depend on them a lot, and you forget what you take for granted. And yeah, I found it quite close to the bone watching The Shining. There was only one tiny bit of relief in the whole film that I felt. Well, I don't know if you call it relief, because it was quite early on, and it was a scene where Jack first arrives at the hotel, and you have the buzz of, there's people there, they're sort of milling about, they're mingling, they're talking, there's touch, and at that point I felt almost quite comforted because it seemed so normal. And then all of a sudden, very quickly in the film, you're thrust into this isolation. And the part where it really hit home for me was where Wendy, the Shelley Duvall character, when she goes over to Jack and he's at his desk writing, and he suddenly turns on her verbally. And up to that point, and I believe this was a point of friction with Stephen King, because apparently in the novel, which I've never read, I tried reading and I didn't enjoy what I read, so I stopped. But apparently he felt that the character of Jack, is it Jack Torrance?
Mm-hmm.
It's Jack, both the actor and the character. He felt that Jack should be a warmer character to begin with, and then sort of spiral into this, gradually become mad. But of course, Jack Nicholson, there's something about him that's quite dislikable from the very beginning of that movie. So I just felt it didn't let up, and then, you know, the further into isolation it gets, but psychologically and physically, of course, because they're in this hotel in the middle of nowhere. But psychologically, when Shelley Duvall realizes that her husband is turning on her, and it's kind of an oh shit moment, that really jarred me. And then it was a very, very intense experience from then on.
I mean, I think that I suppose the thing that we probably need to kind of get to in this conversation tonight is about what it is about isolation and how it's used in horror films, and what it is that actually provides the horror. Where is the horrific element? What's the terror that we're feeling? I just watched The Lodge, sort of the latest of the Hammer films, and I kind of feel it's borrowing quite heavily from The Shining, in terms of, once again, it's another thing that's set in a remote place in the middle of a sort of snowy epic kind of emptiness. And there is, for me, I think, something about that juxtaposition of, like, even a little family unit of something in amongst nothingness that sort of just really, not to use snowy jokes the whole way through, but there is something quite chilling about that prospect, about that being alone and that fear. I'm kind of, like, for me, I think The Shining is very much a study about sort of the destruction of one's sanity as well. And I don't know, is that the fear? Is that the problem with these films? Is that what our real fear is about isolation? Is it just sort of that fear of sort of losing our minds?
It's definitely a psychological thing, and I think when it hits home is when we start, because you mentioned the family unit in The Shining and in The Lodge, which I've not seen, but when that family unit starts splitting up and the characters start becoming isolated from one another, that's where it gets very scary psychologically, I think, and that's where the descent into madness begins. I think you feel cut off from others.
What do you reckon, Keri? I mean, is this something presumably this is something that, you know, we see time and time again in the films? Is this something that kind of works for you, or?
Well, I can't comment on The Lodge because I haven't seen that, I'm afraid. But certainly, what I think it is, I think whether it's a family unit or whether it's an individual that's taken to some remote area where they are completely cut off, I think it's a reminder to people that are watching that of the great vulnerability of people when they are on their own. Because in everyday life, even if you happen to live in quite a small community, you are often bound up with lots of other things that are going on in that community. Kind of social rules, regulations, norms, things that when you're removed from them, maybe you realize how much you rely on them. And I think what horror does is it puts that under the microscope. So where you may feel at odds with your surroundings, it takes it to the next level, I suppose, and makes it more overt. And I think it just maybe reminds people how much they do rely on others, or they do rely on certain structures and systems. And I think with The Shining, it does that to the nth degree, because they are so physically remote and in such a vast place. It's like it's creating a more pressured version of things that people might recognize, I think, if they've ever been in some situation where they've been at odds with the society that would normally surround them. And I think as well, with The Shining, that family unit so quickly become alienated from one another that they don't even have that. They don't even have that, the smallest unit of social interaction. Very quickly, even the child is kind of alienated from the parents, and the husband and wife from each other. So I think it works in a way, kind of microcosm. Maybe it chimes with people because it calls many other things to mind that they might recognize, maybe, or maybe be afraid of seeing happen to them.
I think I was sitting thinking about not just The Shining, but a lot of other films that kind of came to mind, and it also strikes me that when you take people out of normality and you isolate them, whether you're isolating them in a room or in a house or a cabin or a massive hotel, as they do in The Shining, there is a sort of a separation between the normal and the current existence. But I think I'm going to put forward a suggestion. I'm open to sort of see what you think. There's two things at play within these sorts of isolation horrors. One, and both of them prey upon our own fears. One of them is the fear of everything that's outside. So I think about something like, The Evil Dead. And when I think about that, the cabin in the woods, obviously there's a whole world outside that's risking kind of coming in and destroying that little network. But the other thing that we're scared of is actually being trapped inside with somebody else. And one of the films that I think Keri had suggested to me this week was 10 Cloverfield Lane, which sort of works on both those principles. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know what to expect from that film, from 10 Cloverfield Lane. I wasn't sure how much it was going to be a continuation of Cloverfield, of the film that had come before it, in terms of a monster mythos. And actually has almost nothing to do with that. It's only maybe a handful of scenes that link in with that. I think that the horror of 10 Cloverfield Lane for me is that the situation that the protagonist finds herself in at first does seem to be, however strange it is, the best situation that she could find herself in if what the male character tells, I forget his name actually, but he tells her that the rest of society has gone to hell. Everything's gone, everything's dead. The best chance for you is to be in here. And at first that seems fairly plausible. If things are that bad, then whilst this is strange, then it's preferable. But I mean, very quickly she begins to doubt the motivations of her friend, her helper, and his behavior becomes more erratic. And I just think that quickly then becomes, it would be better to be out there and maybe take your chances with whatever it is, if there is anything out there, than be in this incredibly restricted environment with somebody who you don't know and whose character you don't know. And I think John Goodman enacts it brilliantly, where he balances just enough this kind of paternal character against this potentially a character that's got other motivations. I don't think it's ever particularly sexualized, but certainly there's something more to him, which I think becomes quite menacing. And I think it does that very well. But I agree with you. It captures both horrors, really. There's something outside, but there's someone in here. And, which of those things is actually more frightening?
Yeah, I'm left by the end of that film not entirely sure which of the two is the one that I want to be stuck either the inside or the outside, because they both, I mean, in many respects, spoiler for anyone who hasn't seen that film actually presents both as not being particularly good options. There's a bad side no matter what you do. And it's interesting how that plays upon our own kind of existential fears and our own, it comes down to the fear of the unknown, I suppose, in this sense that, somebody separated from the rest of the world and other regular forms of communication will gradually lose it. I mean, it's something that, David, you've already touched on this, and it's something I definitely have felt at various points over the last lot of months, is there's, that separation from real people, from having proper conversations, from interaction, does start to do things to your head a little bit. Yeah.
I'll mention, if I may, a third, because you mentioned this fear of the outside and then fear of the the inside, the people that you're stuck with. But then there's also the fear of yourself and going too deep into your inner self. And if I may bring another film into it, another film I've watched over the past couple of days, which is to a large part about self-loathing and self-hate, is The Bride of Frankenstein, which is about isolation more in the sense of loneliness. So we're talking more psychological isolation. And of course, the monster scenes in that are absolutely heartbreaking, as they are, I think, in the first Frankenstein film of 1931. But in the sequel, you have the monster sort of, and I think he is actually called the monster in the Universal series, isn't he? I'm not projecting that onto it, as opposed to, say, the creature or whatever. He is very definitely Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah.
And there's a scene where he sees himself in the stream, and sees how ugly he is, or how ugly he perceives himself to be. It kind of, with all the, as you know, I'm a bit of an armchair theologian, and so it's a great horror film for all the theological allusions and biblical allusions. and it's very much that scene where he sees himself in the stream, where he sees his reflection. Very much reminded me of Adam, where God asks him, who told you? Well, he asks Adam and Eve, who told you you were naked? Because they're ashamed of their nakedness. And in the same way, Frankenstein's monster sees himself and he hates what he sees, and that you kind of ask yourself the question, who told you you were ugly? And then, of course, James Whale himself, or the script writer anyway, fleshes that out with he goes on to be almost literally crucified, raised up on a cross, and then thrown onto a wagon and tied up and stuff. So his thing, the monster's thing, is this self-loathing and being trapped with himself. That's part of his loneliness, really. And of course, it's enforced by everyone around him, including, in the end, his mate, sadly, who takes one look at him and screams, as well you might do if you discovered Boris Karloff was your groom.
Yeah, it's a fine place to come at this. I mean, that sort of inner self-loathing, I think, comes through in a lot of these films. You know, when I think about The Shining, I mean, there's elements of that. It's Jack sort of not really wanting to deal with his own issues, with his own sort of vaguely abusive past, that's hinted at repeatedly. Obviously, you know, Frankenstein, I think we're going to get on to talking about Dracula shortly as well. And I mean, Dracula's another one of those characters, I think, that there's a sort of inner not being completely happy with himself. Just before this started, we were talking about the sort of the Edgar Allan Poe picks that Roger Corman did. I mean, something like Fall of the House of Usher, where that family literally hates themselves because they just see themselves as so corrupt, and the building becomes this representation. So they shut themselves off from everybody else in order to live in this sort of palatial building that's crumbling in the end of the line, to the point where, you know, you effectively wish death upon your family because you can't deal with that. And you kind of got to sit there and wonder how much of this is because you're so separated from reality, and how much of this is this inner dislike. Keri.
Yeah, I think I'm just thinking about Poe and about the short stories that he wrote, and I think that Corman did a fantastic job with them. He obviously made them immensely beautiful to look at, but I think he kept the sense which Poe kept throughout his stories of having reached a point where you can go no further. I think maybe with House of Usher, you get that, with the Mask of the Red Death. Well, various of the stories that I could name that have been filmed, but I do think, yeah, it's often a family unit, or it's some kind of social group that can go no further beyond that point, that they are just too effete, or they are too corrupted, or they are too just jaded by the world as they see it, that there's no happy ending. I think Corman does that really, really well. I think, you know, not to just keep naming films, but, you know, The Mask of the Red Death as an illustration of what I've just talked about. These people are just incredibly moribund, and there's nowhere for them. This is like their last shebang, I guess. And all the way through, as lurid and as colourful as it is, you just get this horrible feeling of impending doom, that these are failed individuals. I think, you know, with the exception of maybe one character, their corruption catches up with them. And I think that's something that comes across really well in a lot of these kind of family social group orientated horror films. But I really like the way that Corman did it.
I revisited Premature Burial, and it's incredible when you think through the themes that are explored, just how bleak these films were. It's like you were saying, Keri, about the you know, the sort of impending doom, and the sense that there's nowhere else to go, and you really feel that in Premature Burial. It's got all the familiar sort of Poe/Corman tropes, like the sort of crumbling house in the middle of nowhere, and it's incredibly bleak because there's no good option for this central character. He's terrified that, like his ancestors, he's going to, because he's got catalepsy, that he's going to fall into a sleep and they're going to mistakenly bury him. So he's absolutely obsessed with sort of self-preservation, but the only thing he's really preserving is this life of fear and this obsession with death and all these memories that are haunting him, and all the secrecy and the fear of loving. And so, no matter whether he dies or he stays alive, he's still going to be obsessed with all these things that are keeping him lonely and isolated and afraid to love. And then in the end, I think it was with Premature Burial, it turned into a bit of almost like a sort of, not a detective mystery, but it was sort of got a bit of run-of-the-mill thriller in the end. But the themes that come up in it are, you don't want to look too deep into those themes because they're actually quite bleak. Although we are here to look deep into those themes, obviously.
We are indeed. I mean, I've recently reread a number of the Poe short stories, and that kind of bleakness and that fear is very, very, very palpable. And I mean, Premature Burial is a really good example because, as you say, he's got this fear of catalepsy. He's actually literally afraid of being being alone, waking up and finding that he's dead but he's not dead, and nobody being around him to kind of look after him, which strikes me as being a very sort of very typical of the human condition. There's one of those things.
There's also this scene where, if you recall, there's this dream sequence where he imagines that everything he's sort of got this plan, sort of how he's going to rescue himself if he does get buried prematurely. And he has this nightmare sequence where it all goes wrong. And the ironic thing is that the final thing that goes wrong is that he's allowed for suicide if none of his plans to rescue himself from his grave go well. Then there's always this poison chalice that he can drink from, and he'll die. And even that goes wrong, so he can't even kill himself. And it's like, it's just bleak on top of bleak on top of bleak. And I think when you look at those films on the surface, because they have these sort of quite, I don't want to diss Ray Milland, but he can be a bit hammy. He was quite good in this, to be fair. But because the Corman Poe films have these elements of hamminess, like usually Vincent Price's presence and stuff, it's tempting to view them as sort of, a bit more lightly. But yeah, it's like I say, when you think too deep, it's bleak on top of bleak, really.
I think they would struggle to get something like that made now. I mean, there was The Raven, wasn't it, a few years ago, which was a kind of biopic of Poe's, but I think they would really struggle to get some of the Corman era Poe films made now. I just don't think people would want to touch them with a 10-foot pole. There's no way on earth. I think they're just too bleak. There's no let up in them at all.
Well, I was just wondering whether, I mean, I don't know if anyone's actually looked into this sort of, a sort of research-wise, what's happened to people's viewing habits in terms of horror over the lockdown and such. But horror being really, and I felt this very much with Premature Burial in particular, it's watching a horror film is kind of it's a safe space within which to experience all your fears, and you can be completely exposed to all these awful things, but it's actually, ultimately, it's very safe. And I just wondered, with everything that's going on in the outside world now, and the fact that all of us, to varying degrees, are experiencing this horror of isolation ourselves in our real lives, I just wondered whether people were turning away from horror or turning to it.
Well, what have you done, Keri? I mean, have you embraced it more, or have you sort of walked away from it during this weird year?
From horror, I mean, I don't think it's changed my viewing habits all that much, but that probably says more about me than it does about changes going on. I have noticed that we're starting to get coming through quite a lot of made during lockdown, made during the pandemic horror films. I confess I've not delved too far into those because, to be honest, I'm a little bit concerned that they're just going to be time fillers rather than worthwhile. I know I'd like to be proved wrong. It's just finding the time to be proved wrong. But I mean, I think more generally, I think I've read that people have been turning more to more science fiction kind of outbreak related, that kind of related horror. I guess like David, because the way that you're saying, people want to experience it in a very safe medium, which horror and to a lesser extent sci-fi provides you with, where you don't actually have to be at risk in any way, but you can play through the same emotions and thoughts that you might have where you're faced with something like that. But personally, I don't think it's changed particularly what I've been watching, with the exception of maybe a couple of titles, one of which we've already mentioned, and I think we'll get on to the other in a while. But what about you, David? Has it affected what you watch?
I don't think I've watched a great deal of horror, and I'm not sure if that's because I've been avoiding it, or if that's just a coincidence. Although I did notice early on in the lockdown, when it was all quite new to us, this isolation, and we're talking like early in the lockdown, as in when we couldn't even go out for more than an hour a day. Felt like the guys with jetpacks from Fahrenheit 451 were going to come after us if we went out for more than an hour or two. And in those times, I noticed I was watching like Disney and stuff, and of course, this new Disney Channel thing, Disney streaming service or whatever it's called, had come out just at the right time, because it was literally scheduled to come out just as we were locking down. Perhaps a conspiracy theory there. And and I was watching things like Snow White, and I could understand for the first time why Disney rose to prominence and rose in such popularity at one of the bleakest times in the 20th century, is that during the Great Depression and leading up to the war and such, because it was the perfect sort of escapism that I felt I needed at that time. So I certainly felt the pull to that sort of very comfortable viewing. But yeah, I'm not sure if I've not been particularly drawn to horror or away from it. I did watch one of those lockdown horrors that you referred to, because everyone had been talking about this one that was either made for Shudder, or certainly it's been released as a Shudder exclusive. I think it's I can't even remember the name now, and it's basically a seance that takes place in a Zoom call. Who knows how this Zoom call is going to go? Is there a script for this?
It's really, yeah.
Is one of you suddenly going to start floating up to the ceiling or something? Everyone had been saying how wonderful this Host, it was called, how wonderful this film was, and it was less than an hour. And I have to say, it was very well made. It was quite scary in places, but a few of the scares were a bit predictable and stuff. But it was a good attempt. I could see why it was popular. But I digress.
I know you haven't asked me, but I think having walked away from horror a lot in recent years for various reasons that I know my present company well and truly understand, I've kind of found myself coming back to it. I found myself re-embracing some of those things, and I think it is that escapism. I think for me, it probably started off at the start of lockdown. We did an event, an online event, how to survive the apocalypse according to the movies, but which was heavily drawn on kind of zombie films and sort of things like Last Man on Earth. So already I was kind of watching all these Contagion films. I was getting into this sort of post-apocalyptic kind of horrors, and to me, like walking around, something like Last Man on Earth made more sense than anything I was experiencing in real life. So I actually found a great deal of comfort in it. And then I started going back to some of the other trappings. I started picked up more collectibles within the genre. I started making art that was within the genre. I mean, like for me, this is a safe space, because no matter what's going on, like the horror films are always going to be, they're either going to present me with stuff that seems too fantastic and I've nothing to be scared of, or their fantasticness prepares me for whatever shit life is going to throw. So it's been a weird thing. But I'm very happy to kind of be re-embracing it. It's not a bad space, and revisiting some of the classic horrors as well. I mean, we've talked already about Corman. We've talked about Edgar Allan Poe and Frankenstein. Something else that we've sort of briefly alluded to was Dracula, and I know, Keri, you had a lot to say about Nosferatu in particular, not just the 1922 Nosferatu, the 1979 Nosferatu, which I feel I'll hold my hands up and say I think I've treated it very unfairly over the years. I've never given it enough time. So sell me on that. What did you see in it?
Right. Okay. Well, I share your enthusiasm for the original Nosferatu because, by most people's estimations, it's the first horror film, and it still stands up. It holds up incredibly well. The 1979 one, for me, is one of my favourite films. I think it's probably the most existentially bleak horror film I can think of. And I've seen a few. For me, it really is high up there. It's fantastic in terms of what it does with Dracula as a character. Because I think until that point, we had Dracula as a character, quite a various character. If you think about Lugosi, this kind of suave but corrupt nobleman. In Nosferatu, so going right back to the beginning, you get very little sense of him as a character. I think he's more of a ghoulish figure in that. But I think by the time you come to Kinski's depiction of him, he's a fleshed out character for the first time. And I think for the first time, you are, I won't say encouraged, but allowed to see Dracula as a very tragic figure. But I think there's actually very little of that in depictions of him up until that point. I think the whole point of the Kinski depiction of him is to put across that misery that he feels, where he has to outlive everybody that he's ever cared about for reasons that he can't control. He can't do anything other than feed on human blood. He doesn't set out to do anything bad or wrong. It's simply in his nature. And whilst I think you could read between the lines in earlier depictions of Dracula, I think in Kinski's depiction of him for the first time, that is it is front and center. It's exactly what you are meant to take away from that. And also the way in which he relates to Lucy in that, because they all seem to sort of swap character names around in Dracula films for some reason. But he's drawn towards her because she represents something that he can no longer be. She's a genuinely innocent person who wants to do what she can. And I don't wish to spoiler it. Hopefully anybody that would be listening has seen it. But the ending is incredibly, incredibly bleak. It's entirely in keeping with everything else. Dracula may not be around anymore, but the curse has been passed on to Lucy's love. And you think maybe in centuries to come, he'll be behaving in exactly the same way as Dracula was at the time that we see him in the narrative. And I just think it captures something so almost unique. It's been done since, but for me, it's never been done quite that well. That, you've got a character that can't not live forever, saying time is an abyss. The longer I live, the worse existence is for me. And the one thing that he could do to get out of this cycle, he can't bring himself to do. It needs to be someone else that releases him. I just think it's absolutely superb. I don't know what other people take from that, but for me, I think it's probably one of the most bleak narratives I can think of.
So for him, that the isolation is sort of what being this character that's sort of completely separate from the rest of the world, as well as being physically distant in a kind of space of his own that is separate. Yeah, am I that right in saying that?
Yes, yeah. A lot of the tropes that are there in the novel are taken away. There's no sort of sultry brides sort of draping themselves over things. That doesn't happen in this. It's just him. So, and also he retains a lot of the very ghoulish appearance of the original Nosferatu in terms of the long claw-like nails and the bald head and the slightly, the features and everything, but with a lot of humanity intact. So he's not simply a monster. He's an unwitting monster. And he tries to explain that predicament to Lucy. And I think that's that kind of dichotomy between being repulsive, but yet having the heart and feeling or remembering human emotion. I think maybe that's got more in common with Frankenstein's creature than it does with some of the earlier Draculas, because with Frankenstein's creature, he knows he's the only member of that species. His desire for a mate is thwarted. He says, she hates me as soon as she takes one look at him in that scene. So I just think it's very interesting, maybe comparison against that other classic monster. But I don't think it's ever been done quite as well as it was done in the Herzog film.
I think you're very right there. as I was describing the Bride of Frankenstein, and the creature's story there, or the monster's story, very similar to Kinski's Nosferatu, which I have revisited this week in light of your mentioning it. And I totally agree with your analysis. He is such a tragic character. And I think you mentioned reading between the lines of earlier portrayals, I think. And certainly, like, for example, when you look at, say, Christopher Lee, and you look at that final scene in the 1958 Dracula where he dies, there's a lot of pathos there because, as I think most Lee fans anyway would agree, that he was able to act brilliantly with his eyes. And there's such sadness in that final scene where Dracula is destroyed in 1958. But you never get that really fleshed out. You essentially get a character where he's just playing the long game for his ultimate goal of getting his hands on human blood and what have you. And he's essentially, once his cover's blown, he's completely feral. Where with Kinski, he comes across so lonely and isolated, and so tragic from the beginning. And when he welcomes Harker, I get the sense that he's really grateful of the company. He's so pleased to have someone to show hospitality to talk to. And there's just sadness in his eyes at every single point. I think there was only one part where I identified some anger, and it was where he was. I think he was possibly by either when he first visits Lucy in her bedroom or something, or it's one of those scenes with Lucy, and there's something he says where he suddenly gets a bit fierce. But other than that, it's just always, he's very reluctant. He doesn't want to be. He's condemned to this eternal living, and there's a lot of dialogue in there. I can't remember how much of it is from Stoker. I don't think a great deal of it is. I think it's original to the film. You can correct me if I'm wrong there, but he does talk a lot about being condemned to live on and on. And there's obviously, I got most of it from the subtitles because I don't speak German, but one of the subtitles was where he refers to the absence of love is abject pain, and he's missing love, and he looks in through the window at Jonathan and Lucy at one point, and he so longs for that love and companionship. And I do get the sense, as I think you said, that he does not want to be malicious, but he really can't help himself. It's what he needs to survive. And so there is, like when Jonathan Harker cuts his thumb on a knife at dinner, and you get the sense that Dracula's quite reluctant to go in, but he's irresistibly drawn to it. And that's there all the way through that film. And I found his character intriguing because it was just so sad, and he was just so lonely. And such a brilliant performance from Kinski. You're right that it has a depth to it that I don't think I've seen in any previous Dracula film. So I was really quite glad I revisited that. Although yes, quite sad.
I'm glad you did. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think most of that is original. I don't think those are Stoker's words. I think those are words that were added to the script. But as you say, it works brilliantly well. And I think it's very telling as well that he doesn't, even though there is that slight note of anger when he speaks to Lucy, he doesn't attack her. I mean, he could very easily do that. He could be the monster that he has the ability to be. But he always seems to be fighting against that and trying, and there is some better nature there that prevents him from simply being the monster.
He almost just kind of slinks off in that scene, doesn't he? Because it reminded me of when, a vampire can't attack you in your house unless he's invited in. But he's already in the house. There's nothing stopping him. But it's like when she indicates she's sort of not up for it, he just kind of slinks away back through the door. And of course, we only see his shadow because we see in the mirror, and we don't actually see him as he leaves. But yeah, he really
it's
doesn't
incredibly
want to be
subtle.
wrong. Yeah.
You've got me convinced that I need to give it a rewatch.
And there was, in fact, sorry, I was just going to say that because I jotted down a few lines, and there was another brilliant line about how awful it was to be unable to grow old and to spend centuries enduring the futility of every day. And it just made me think of lockdown. I don't want to compare myself to Dracula, but it was the endless. In fact, in most of the films I watched in preparation for this, there was something in The Shining where I can't remember if it was what was the name of the murderer in The Shining? The one played by Philip Stone. I can't remember.
Can't recall.
He comes in and he says something like, "You've always been caretaker here. You've been around since 1921." And when I heard, and when I saw that scene, I thought, yeah, it's pretty much how lockdown feels. Yeah, I feel like I've been here since 1921. So yeah, there's so many things in all these characters we've been discussing that sort of resonate with where I'm at right now.
Well, there is clearly a thing with Dracula that, I mean, I hadn't given it a massive deal of thought before, but this sense that the thing that he seems to relish is the thing that also is going to make him even more of a despicable creature, which is the presence of somebody else willingly coming to his abode. And, you know, I mean, the novel does a fairly good job of he's quite decent to Harker initially, up until the point where, you know, you steal his girlfriend, you drain him of all his life force. I mean, that's by the by. But obviously there is this desire to be a genuine warm being, and even in the cinematic depictions that we've had, there is something kind of affable. He has to present this quite pleasant exterior, but there's never any kind of guilt whenever the unpleasantness actually kind of comes to the fore. I mean, Christopher Lee is quite happy devouring everybody left, right, and center. You know, he doesn't sort of sit there morosely kind of head in hands wishing he'd bitten somebody else instead of the people that wanted to have a chat. So I mean, I think, you know, whilst you may not want to draw the analogy between us and Dracula, I think it's there. I think that maybe that's that thing, is the separation from the rest of the world just makes things more uncomfortable, but also it can make it slightly more unbearable, which I want to use that as an excuse to talk about another film that I adore, and that's The Babadook. Have we both seen that?
I have seen it, but not recently.
Okay.
So you might have to re-educate me. I remember the basic gist.
Well, The Babadook is basically a film. It's about a mother and her child living in a house where they're haunted by this mysterious, almost creepily cartoon-like character called the Babadook that just sort of creeps around the place and makes things unpleasant. But the film is essentially, I think, a film about deteriorating mental health. It's about, a bit like The Shining, it's about her gradually losing her sanity and manifesting her frustrations, her anger, her upset, I guess, at being a single mother, reluctant single mother, and being quite physically and emotionally abusive. And the Babadook itself is a manifestation of that. And I think it's a really good sort of example about that fear of being alone, both in a physical space in the house that she's in, but also in terms of this sort of more relationship space. She is stuck by herself. She's no longer part of a family unit as such. She's been left stranded, and I think the film kind of toys with both those fears. Keri, you seem to remember it slightly better. Am I misreading it, do you think, or?
It's been some years since I've seen it, but it did make quite a big impression on me. I thought it was very well done. I think, is it Jennifer Kent, the name of the director? I've seen her most recent film, which is another study in isolation, although a slightly different one. It's a historical epic rather than a straightforward horror film. But I thought The Babadook was very good. I think maybe by about halfway you can see where it's going. You can see what this creature is representing, the symbolism of this, this unexpected visitor. But I do think it works very, very well. And I think that you do get a sense of the way that she's unraveling. It's made 10 times worse by the little boy. I mean, because he's got such profound behavioral issues, and he screams, and it is quite difficult, to be in the same space as. And I think that just immediately creates this sense of sympathy for her character. So I think, without that, I don't think the horror would work at all. But you certainly feel you get the sense of it's a projection of her unraveling mental state, her isolation, and her anger at the way that her marriage ended. I do think it's very, very well done.
I mean, I suppose that there is a common thread when we think about a lot of these films, is that a lot of it is tied in with relationships, with human relationships and interaction, with the I suppose I mean, is a lot of these things coming down to just an absolute fear of literally, it's not the isolation in itself that causes the fear, but it's the fear of that is all that is left for us, is just complete separation from everyone else. Is that the thing that's really driving a lot of these films, do we think?
Yeah, I do think that this fear of is this all there is, I guess, is the way you might sum it up. Maybe people coming to the end of the idealism stage of their lives, if there is an idealistic stage of your life, and maybe being confronted with that as a reality, that you've come to the end of the line in some respects. This is what you've got waiting for you, and it's understandable that would take on some kind of a monstrous form. I think people often would rather externalize that than always deal with it as an internal factor. So maybe that is a driving force behind some of the horror that's come up with this kind of a theme. I mean, what do you guys think?
David?
I think a lot of it is to do with something you mentioned before, Keri, I think, which is exposing all the things that we rely on, the things we take for granted. I've certainly found during this pandemic that there's all kinds of things, even the smallest interactions with people that you rely on and take for granted as a way of keeping yourself sane and keeping yourself ticking over. And when all that stuff is taken away, it gets very scary. And yeah, so I think that probably is a source of horror. Those things we rely on being taken away, the things we didn't realize we were relying on.
And yeah,
those
I think
relationships and yeah.
I mean, that stuff is there, and I mean we've talked a lot about this sort of separation, but then I suppose we've already mentioned this as well, but I think it's also worth reiterating the fact that one of the other things that is at play within a lot of these films is the fear not so much that you're separated from other people, but that actually that maybe you're stuck with somebody who is not who you want to be with either. And I mean, I don't even need to cite the domestic abuse statistics for lockdown period, which haven't been great. But obviously you've got like Shelley Duvall's character in The Shining, where she's stuck with a husband that is literally psychotic and a threat both to her and her child. In The Babadook, I mean, really it's the kid that we should feel empathy for, because he's stuck there with a mother that is not actually doing what's good for him. If you think about, I mean, I mentioned the Evil Dead films. I mean, there you're stuck in a cabin with a bunch of friends who potentially are infected. Any one of whom could be the threat that brings death to you. And ultimately Dracula, each of those films is about some kind of social interaction that ultimately will lead to your death. Even something like Halloween, which actually is a film that preys a lot on isolation, or The Thing, the Carpenter films, like they play on isolation too. About separating us from other people, about having to whittle things down, about having to work out what can and can't be trusted, and just sort of upsetting our kind of appreciation for safety, I guess. Keri, was there any other films you want to talk about? Because I know you mentioned a couple to me earlier on, and I want to give you a chance to talk about them, because there's films I don't know about at all.
I was just thinking about, I mean, with the Babadook, you were saying that you've got this kind of domestic situation where you find that you're with someone, or there's something going on in that situation that makes you realize that that's not good for you, or it's not good for them. I was thinking of a film that came out this year. It's called The Swerve. Is it a horror? I mean, I think it's borderline a horror film, but it's, again, this kind of situation where you've got domestic horror. So you've got a woman that is more or less invisible to her husband. She's got 2 teenage sons who treat her like a servant. She seems just about able to tolerate this. But then there are a few different events that take place over the space of a couple of days that just see her completely spin out of control. So one of which is her sister comes back from wherever she's been. I think you can more or less put two and two together and think that she's been in some kind of rehab. So she reappears on the scene. And then the smallest thing possible, she sees a mouse in the kitchen. And because her home is her castle and her pride, she becomes obsessed with catching this mouse. Husband tells her she's mad. Sons roll their eyes at her. But she becomes absolutely obsessed with laying traps or looking for it. She thinks it bites her when she tries to reach for it. And something as simple as that just seems to send her completely out of control, where she starts looking at her sleep medication and wondering if it's doing the job properly, because she keeps waking up and thinking she can see this mouse in the bedroom. And then she goes back to the therapist, who kind of brushes her off. And her job, she gets a little bit more attention for what she does. She's a high school teacher, but then the kind of attention that she's getting there isn't necessarily appropriate, and it's not good for her. So I guess it's kind of, you could call it the cinematic version of the straw that breaks the camel's back. But she's already in a highly stressed situation where she's not appreciated. She is very much taken for granted by the people in her life. She's in a very unhappy situation, and it only takes a couple of things to break around her to completely derail her. It's called the Swerve because she is obsessed with the idea that when driving home from a family party, she accidentally swerved in the road and caused an accident. There's never any indication that she's actually done this, but it's a facet of her anxiety and the fact that she's losing grip on reality. And it's massively effectively done. It's incredibly sad. There's, I don't think, a moment of real let-up in the entire film, but it's so sensitively done and so very well handled that it is definitely a contender for one of the films of the year for me. And I think particularly coming out at this time when, as you say, many people are thrown together when they wouldn't necessarily want to spend that much time together. It's very bad for a lot of couples and families, but it just encapsulates the very realistic horror of that and plays it out to an extreme, very much in the line of a tragedy, a kind of modern tragedy, more in the kind of Miller era than a classic tragedy, but a tragedy nonetheless, and it works incredibly well. And I would recommend you see it, but have something a little lighter to watch afterwards, maybe.
Snow White.
Snow White's a horror film. I don't know how you don't see this, David. That is definitely
that scares me to death. It scared me so much when I was a little girl. I don't think I could revisit that. I'd watch the Swerve again.
I mean, Disney is. I mean, you mentioned it earlier as like a little happy place, but Disney films are full of horror. They are not great films in terms of like all happiness and light. There's a lot of very dark gothic tropes in there, and a lot of
true.
A lot of isolation too. Look, we're gonna have to wrap this up, I think. But is there anything else that you want to add before we do reach a conclusion at this point? Or anything you want to recommend?
I appreciate the film recommendation, Keri, of the Swerve. I'll see if I can check it out. I guess what you described is really the ultimate in horror when you start questioning yourself. And I guess that's what struck me as I was watching some of these films, was how the experience of watching horror very much mirrors the experiences in the story that you're watching, the experiences of the character, being forced to second guess yourself, being sort of on the edge of your seat, being really allowing ourselves to be gaslit for 90 minutes. And it's such a scary prospect. We've talked about questioning others around us and questioning our relationships and the people that we're with. But when we've questioned them, and then we start questioning ourselves, it's like the ultimate foundation, our trust in ourselves. It's the ultimate thing we can think we can always rely on in the end. And when other people cause you to question that, or your circumstances cause you to question that, it's a very scary thing indeed. And I don't think we brought it up in this conversation, but certainly Robert and I were talking about it beforehand, Rosemary's Baby, which is, for me, the scary thing about that, both the 1968 film and the novel, which it's very close to, is that sense of isolation that comes from, first of all, being cut off from the other people around you and feeling on your own that way, but then questioning yourself and questioning your own sanity is the loneliest place to be in. And I think that's really what happens to us when we watch a horror film. We're forced to question ourselves, but of course, in a very safe way, which is, I guess, the good thing about horror films. As I said at the beginning, a safe space to experience those things that terrify us most.
Yeah, I think I would just follow on from that, really, that although we are maybe coming to these films from a particularly bleak time, this year has been a very strange year. I'm glad that the films are there. I mean, even if we're coming to them from a different perspective and maybe we are seeing more of our own situation mirrored in those films, I'm glad that that's there as a kind of fantastical version of that, where, as you say, it's safe and it's contained, and maybe it is a way of helping people play through some of those emotions. I mean, I certainly feel that there are lots of positives to match against maybe some of the negative, introspective stuff that you get from watching some of these films. So I think ultimately I'm glad they're there, and if it leads me to a different perspective on looking at some of these films again, then I think that's no bad thing.
Yeah, I will happily endorse all of that. And I think, David, I knew we were possibly going to get on the gaslighting, but we haven't really kind of done it today. It's an interesting way to talk about it in terms of the whole cinema experience is a gaslighting experience. Is something I've never thought of before, that we basically are tricking ourselves for 90 minutes in the dark into believing something that actually isn't true at all. So I'm never going to watch a film in quite the same way again. Incidentally, if you're interested in gaslighting, we do have a Cinepunked podcast on Gaslight. I thoroughly recommend you don't give that a download and listen to as well. I think we're going to wrap it up here. This is sort of like scraping the surface because, this has been a weird time in our lives, and the cinema has offered us all kinds of interesting perspectives on what happens out there, and horror has offered us all sorts of interesting perspectives on how to build up that fear. But now we're actually living it. It's a very, very different situation from whatever else. I do think for me, the thing that is crucial to all of this is I think the thing that separates a lot of these sort of isolation horrors, it's that fear of not having normal communication. It's that need to communicate with other people, to be part of the world, to be a regular person, is what makes all the difference to our sanity. And I think a lot of these are tied in with mental health stuff as well. But look, we can continue on this conversation on social media. David is on Twitter as David L. Rattigan, and Keri is on there as Hellbound_Heart. It's a nice little Clive Barker reference there in case you haven't spotted it, but I imagine most of you watching this get that. So all I got to do is say thank you very much again to David and Keri for having a chance to chat horror with you for the first time in a little while. It's been a pleasure. And
thank you.
Hopefully not the last time either.
Thank you very much.
So yeah, and for those of you who watch things as part of Dark Hedges, enjoy the rest of the Dark Hedges Festival, and do check out Cinepunked, cinepunked.com, and all our other stuff as well, and we'll talk to you again very soon.